I think we'll go ahead and get started. Let me just begin by welcoming everyone to the Spring 2022 Abel Lecture, which is brought to you by the Dr. Harold Abel Endowed Lecture Series in the study of dictatorship, democracy, and genocide. This Endowed Lecture Series was established in 2009, if you can remember back that far, after all we've been through a generous gift by the family of Dr. Abel to honor his 44-year career as an educator. Dr. Abel's distinguished career included a 10-year term as president of this university, Central Michigan University, from 1975 to 1985. And we're especially pleased that members of the Abel family are with us in the audience tonight, and we thank them for their active and ongoing support of this series and our mission here at CMU and in the college. We also want to take a moment to note that International Holocaust Remembrance Day begins tomorrow in the evening, so just about 24 hours from now for our friends in Michigan and the Eastern time zone. As suggested by the full title of the series, the Abel Lecture Series focuses on the impact of historical events such as the Holocaust, genocide, and population-level violence around the world. It wasn't very long ago that our description of the series noted its focus on the Holocaust, and I'm quoting here from text that I think may still be on our website. It focused on the Holocaust and mass murders in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central America. Descriptions like this inevitably reflect their time. The Holocaust happened in Europe, but the implication of our description is that mass murder and genocide are nowadays associated with the global South. And yet here we are in 2022 in the midst of a war in Ukraine with very credible accounts of mass murder and the deliberate displacement of millions not so very far from the heart of Europe. The irony of calling this violence denazification is almost too much to bear. So in the 21st century, genocide and mass violence sponsored by state actors are not just problems of the global South. Our speaker today will offer considerably more evidence for this claim in ways that I think will surprise and even shock those of you who haven't yet encountered Ian Urbina's remarkable writing and reporting. So on to our speaker. Ian Urbina then is our speaker. We're delighted to have him give the Abel Lecture tonight. As you would expect for someone this smart and accomplished, his degrees are in history. I'm a history professor. Perhaps I didn't say that I'm the chair of the history department. That would have made that joke land a little better if I had noted that. With degrees from Georgetown and the University of Chicago. Ian has written for what seems like all the major publications, from the Los Angeles Times to the Guardian to Harper's, from the New York Times to the Atlantic. In 2009, he was part of the team that won a Pulitzer Prize for breaking news reporting on the Eliot Spitzer scandal in the previous year. Again, if you can remember back that far. With apologies for skipping a decade of really remarkable stories and reporting. In 2019, Ian published his book, The Outlaw Ocean: Journeys Across the Last Untamed Frontier, which is a New York Times bestseller that's been translated into multiple languages, and I won't name them all, but I did note that Russian was among them, based on what was by then a remarkable series of reported stories going back to at least 2015, perhaps before that. But it was also in 2019 that Ian left the New York Times to found the Outlaw Ocean Project, which is a nonprofit journalism organization based in Washington, D.C., that produces investigative stories about human rights, environment, and labor concerns on the 2/3 of the planet covered by water. And I was quoting from the site there. All this is amazing, and I'm almost done. I promise we're almost there. But what caught our eye most recently was Ian's 2021 Atlantic article called Purgatory at Sea. I'll just give you the Atlantic's teaser here. Off the coast of Italy, cruise ships are being repurposed as holding pens for migrants rescued from the Mediterranean. That's the end of the teaser. I'm not making this up, and we might just hear more about it tonight. And then in December 2021, a New Yorker article entitled The Secret of Prisons That Keep Migrants Out of Europe. But again, I won't say more about that because we're just about ready to hear from Ian. One more thing I'll just say by way of organizing tonight. When Ian is done speaking, there will be a couple of questions from my co-host, Dr. Christy Brooks, who's here with us. She's professor of French and interim associate dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences here. Then we're going to open the floor to questions from you in the audience. To ask a question, please use the Q&A that's built into WebEx. Christy and I will do our best to keep up with the questions as they come in, and we'll ask them to Ian out loud so everyone can hear both the question and answer. And now please join me in welcoming Ian Urbina for his talk entitled Migrants and Mercenaries on the Outlaw Ocean, a discussion of EU efforts to build a virtual wall across the Mediterranean.
Thank you, Greg. Let me just do a couple of formalities first. Let me say thank you to the Abel family for sponsoring this talk, and to the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences at Central Michigan University for inviting me to speak. Let me also just apologize at the outset. I was diagnosed with COVID yesterday, so if you see me sweating and coughing occasionally, that's why. It's not some Nixonian nervousness on my part. I'm just battling some symptoms. I think my plan is to talk for 20-25 minutes. I'll start at the beginning being, who am I and what is this organization that is called the Outlaw Ocean Project, and then move into what were the ambitions and outcomes of these two connected stories that were mentioned, one in the Atlantic first and the second one in the New Yorker. And I think that'll cover the time, and we'll move to question and answer. So I'm a journalist. I live in Washington, D.C., and have, when I left grad school in a history and anthropology program at the University of Chicago, I went straight to the New York Times and began working on investigative series, mostly, quite often having to do with trafficking of different kinds, sex trafficking, labor trafficking, human trafficking. In 2014, I had a meeting with my editor about taking a look at this watery frontier that I knew a tiny bit about, because when I was procrastinating on my dissertation, which had to do with Cuba, I took a leave from the University of Chicago and went and worked on a ship that was anchored near Singapore, and was exposed to this fascinating sort of world of, diaspora transient tribe, that traversed the planet, and for whom there was this rich history and this distinct mode of, communication, and a very rigid hierarchy, and their own sort of sense of superstitions, and, again, quite anthropologically viewed. I became fascinated by these people who live this very different life in this alternate universe. And then I had to go back to the real world. And so I went back to Hyde Park and continued the grind. But I had always been captivated by, if I could do things differently, I might have chosen that tribe, those people, as the focus of my academic interests. I was ABD. I jumped ship before finishing the dissertation. It was about halfway through because I got offered a job at the New York Times. Decided I was going to go that route, and sort of went through the meat grinder experience of learning how to be a reporter. And ultimately, when I had been at the New York Times for 15 years, I had enough political capital in the bank with editors that when I outed with a crazy idea like send me to sea for 2 years and I'll come back with some incredible stories, and we should help the public reimagine this space that is huge, this space that produces 50% of our air, this space that has, more than 50 million people working out there, from which you rarely hear stories. And I lucked out and had an editor that was willing to cut me loose, and that's just what we did. And we produced the series, The Outlaw Ocean, in the paper. The Outlaw Ocean Project is the child of that original reporting in the Times, and it is the realization that there were too many good stories, and too many of those stories were urgent and woefully undercovered, in my estimation, that I didn't want to pivot to a different target. Investigative reporters usually get 2 years on one topic, and then the bosses, say, we want you to focus on something else because there's so many worthy targets. And so I created my own nonprofit, and I have a staff of 10 now, and we produce these sorts of stories that have different forms. They start as written pieces, but they always have video, usually a doc film, usually a podcast, and also art that comes out of the journalism. I'll describe that later. So the Outlaw Ocean lens on the Mediterranean migrant is pretty obvious. In fact, of the two huge blind spots that didn't get touched on in the Outlaw Ocean book, one was the Chinese fleet. How can you write about lawlessness at sea and not touch on the world's largest fleet that's involved in some of the most intensely egregious behavior? And the second one was the Mediterranean migrant crisis. How can you write a book called The Outlaw Ocean and not touch that place and what's going on there? My answer to both of those questions is I couldn't find a new way to do it. There had been good journalism on both of those topics before, and I only wanted to tackle them if I thought I had a creative new way to do so. So I got a call from someone who's a pianist, an Italian pianist, who's part of our music project, which I'll explain later perhaps, after he had produced an album for the Outlaw Ocean music project. And he told me that he was on a ship on the Mediterranean working for the International Red Cross, and that there were quite literally at any given moment 9 to 11,000 migrants spread across about 6 or 7 huge cruise ships that were being held offshore off the coast of Italy. And the ostensible reason for this was, and probably true, but probably not the whole truth, was COVID vetting. These migrants are being held there to quarantine them before they would be allowed to be let on land. Many of these migrants had already made it to land in Italy, had then been marched onto a vessel and then taken out to sea and held there. The other big reason these folks were being held there was because the migrant issue in Italy, as in the US and as in many coastal states, especially in Europe, had become a hot button political issue. And the more that these migrants were on land, the more they became fodder for political leveraging. And so the thought was out of sight, out of mind. Lastly, you put them on a ship, it's harder for lawyers and human rights advocates and journalists to report on them. And so these ships had never had a journalist on board. They had successfully kept journalists off of them for a year and a half they were running. So all of this is magnetic to an investigative reporter, and I immediately wanted to figure a way to how to get on one of these ships and just to chronicle what was happening. And it's clearly an outlaw ocean issue because all of our stories touch on land, but this was yet another way in which this liminal space, the offshore realm, was being tactically used to sort of push into a gray area of the law. The gray area being, even if there are laws that prevent X, Y, or Z, if you can't enforce that, then what's the good of that law? And when you have folks offshore where there's no one to report whether X, Y, or Z is happening, well, you've very successfully, as a state, accomplished a circumvention of that law. So I had a source who was a high up official at International Red Cross, and convinced them to put me and a videographer in uniform and allow us to volunteer for them for a month as a method to get on the vessels, and off we went. And the story ended up in the Atlantic, and it was as much about this sort of beautiful oddity, which was this pianist, Francesco Tosciali, who was a professional pianist, and he was sort of a caring soul and very involved in these sorts of issues. And he had taken some time off, and he was working on the ship at the same time. And he had found a piano, an old piano in the lower deck in storage of the vessel, and he'd convinced the captain to allow him to bring the piano up on deck and begin playing for the migrants. And I thought, well, that's just beautiful and worthy of writing about, even if it doesn't inherently fit in some larger point. Um, but then it was a chance to talk to these migrants in this strange, watery purgatory. What came out of those conversations with the migrants was this resounding um, uh, clarity of what needed to be our next investigation, which was Libya. To a person, the migrants were talking about brutalities occurring in Libya that kind of blew me away. And I had known from being a decent reader of the papers that Libya was a mess and bad things were happening there, but not in the systematic way that almost the business model of it all that seemed to be coming through the pattern recognition software of these stories. As you talk to them, you started sensing that this was more than just organic detention. This was a business model built around detention. And anyway, so after the Atlantic piece, I decided to take a team to Libya. I took my editor at the time, a guy named Joe Sexton, who was for many years an editor at the New York Times. He was my editor on the Pulitzer Project. He went to ProPublica for 8 years, and then he had just left ProPublica, and I grabbed him up to come work for me. I took the same videographer, photographer, American guy named Pierre Qatar, Lebanese descent, American passport, but living in Italy. Amazing videographer and quite skilled linguist who had Arabic and French and a bunch of different Italian, and so that was going to be useful. And then there was a Dutch documentary filmmaker named Maya Doles who had wanted to make a documentary film about the work that we do at the Outlaw Ocean Project, and so she was part of the team, but more capturing what the team does as opposed to actually doing the reporting with the team. We went to Libya, and again, the thought was, but I'm speeding things along, and I do want to be careful of whether I stay on pace. Thought was, a lot of ink has been spilled already about migrants trying to cross the Mediterranean. The tragedy of what's happening there is pretty well known. Is there a way to reimagine, reconceptualize what's happening there at a bit higher altitude? Number one. And is there also a way to do an explanatory plus narrative plus investigative? So narrative meaning tell a story, have a character, beginning, middle, and end, have an arc to it. Explanatory mean while you're en route, really unpack some core things about how the matrix of this thing works. And investigative, reveal things that were not known before. Right. So these were all the three things we wanted to do. In the end, we spent a week there, and maybe in Q&A we can talk about our captivity, which happened on the final day in Libya. But let's just focus on the story itself. In the end, we focused on one character. This was someone who was killed in the largest and most notorious prison of this dozen or so official migrant prisons that exist in Libya. Our focus was called Al Mabani, which has since been closed largely because of the reporting, but that means in Arabic the buildings. And Al Mabani was the most brutal of places at the time and the biggest. And we wanted to look at a murder that happened in Al Mabani where guards opened fire on a group of migrants who were in the midst of a melee. And one guy was killed. And we thought, let's have that guy as our main character, and let's just sort of figure out his story. Where did he come from and how did he end up there? We didn't know whether his story would truly work as synecdoche. Was his story completely deviant, or was it pretty representative? We got lucky. His story was highly representative. He was a climate migrant. He came from Guinea-Bissau, father, husband, brother, son, farmer, 28. His farm was failing. His two brothers had successfully made it to Italy and Spain. And he decided, look, I'm sure I'm going to die here, and my kids will not survive if I don't do something drastic. I know the odds, but I'm going to roll the dice and I'm going to try to make it to Europe. Tried to go to Morocco first. Price is too high to get in a boat. Moves over to Libya, knowing full well it's a war zone, and really bad things happen there. And he went to Libya, found his way to a smuggler, got in a boat, 20 hours out at sea. Libyan Coast Guard captured his boat, brought them back, sent them to Almabani. So that's a fast version of Aliou Conde's story. Um, so we wanted to follow just his tale as a way into Almabadi, but also then on the explanatory point of view, take a look at what I saw as one of the core problems in the way that this whole issue was being discussed up until that point, which was in the sort of the grappling, the intellectual and rhetorical grappling that would occur between the critics of this system, detention of migrants and sending them back to Libya, versus the advocates of it. There was this sleight of hand that would occur that I felt like we needed to really, really call. And if we could effectively get the public to understand where there was disingenuity or mischief in that maneuver, then we could actually do a service on this very issue. The sleight of hand was thinking of these separate situations and armed forces and realms in a siloed fashion. That was a very intentional and by design method of keeping blame away from key players. So what are the silos? Let's switch to a metaphor, and I, Sexton, my editor, sort of, I credit him for having done this. He said the metaphor here is there is a war on migration. We're not saying there's a war on migrants because that means something different, but there is a war on migration. It is a war because the players involved are armed and they're state financed. And it is on migration because it is aiming to stop the movement of desperate people from one place to another. The war on migration has three armed forces, and it's being orchestrated, funded, and designed by the EU writ large, and quite especially by the frontline coastal states, here, Italy at the forefront, because they experience the heaviest burden of the migration. The three armed forces are the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marines. Again, metaphorically speaking. The Air Force is the border agency that is called Frontex. In Europe, the border agency that, is supposed to protect the entire EU border is Frontex, and it's funded by the EU Commission, and it takes orders from the EU member states, and it has huge assets, guys with guns and SUVs and planes, and Frontex was the Air Force in this war because they 24/7 were running drones and planes over the Mediterranean with the sole purpose of identifying migrant boats and calling in the coordinates to the key players. And I'll unpack key players in a second. So they were providing the essential intel for the capture of these migrants. The Navy. The Navy is this so-called Libyan Coast Guard. Historically, globally, Coast Guards face inward. They're largely meant to protect and police Coast Guards face outward. They're largely meant to protect the coastline from external threats and also just to patrol as a police force the waters. Okay. The Libyan Coast Guard faces towards Libya because their true purpose, their funding, their training, the boats they have, everything comes from the EU. And their true purpose is to stop migrants from reaching Europe. They're not protecting the Libyan coast from external threats. They're protecting the European coast from migrants using Libya as a launching pad. And the Libyan Coast Guard doesn't deny this. And that is the Navy in this war on migration. And then the Army, if you will, the Marines, are the on-land armed forces. And those are a series of militias that really run northern Libya, quite especially the region around Tripoli, because that's where most of the launching happens of migrants. And these militias run everything from the neighborhoods to the detention facilities. And there is a deep and very well documented business model whereby these militias that run the detention centers make money by way largely of extortion, fees. So whenever a boatload of migrants are brought and they're taken to Almabani, the migrants are kept there, and the money to be made on them is either skimming revenue from the aid that's supposed to come in and benefit the migrants, or more likely, squeezing the migrants for the $500 per head that they have to pay to be released. And that means guards walk around with a cell phone and say, "Do you want to call someone?" And they tell them the rate, and they need to find someone, friend, family, whomever, who will wire the money and get them out. And that's the business model of the detention facilities. Okay, so the sleight of hand, to me, is partially solved by stopping the very intentional effort by EU officials and the apologists of the system of keeping the discussion in one silo or another and saying, no, 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 all three of these forces are working hand in glove towards an overall mission. So once that is established, you can no longer say that Italy has no responsibility for the well documented by the UN and everyone else, Amnesty, Doctors Without Borders, us, and a gazillion others, the well documented rape, torture, and extortion that's happening in the detention facilities. EU officials say, well, that's not us, that's the Libyan government. And we don't fund the detention facilities directly, the Libyan government does. And we ask them to clean up things, but that's as much as we can do. This is the sleight of hand. This is the silo maneuver. And this is completely disingenuous because no one would be in the detention facilities if it weren't for the Navy, the Libyan Coast Guard. And if it weren't for Frontex making the Navy effective at their job of finding the people where they never could otherwise, because these planes are calling in the coordinates. And the EU is entirely in control and responsible for the funding, the intel, and everything else that goes towards the return of these people. Now, if you're making a legal argument, and if you're going to discuss this in a true, accurate, whole way, then that's when you get actually one step closer to this being very concretely illegal, and the EU and EU Commission are open to real litigation because there are a bunch of illegalities here. It is illegal under humanitarian law to return people to a place that has been internationally deemed not a place of safety, i.e. a war zone. That's very well established precedent on that. And if the EU is facilitating the return of people to Libya, which has been recognized by everyone, including the EU, as a place not of safety, a port not of safety, then they are facilitating that illegality. And on and on. There are other illegalities within the facilities where there are known traffickers that are being facilitated through the EU, through the Libyan Coast Guard in the facilities. So one of the ambitions, let me see where I am on time. One of the ambitions was to really try to, without losing the narrative, really try to explain things in a way that connected all these players and ultimately achieve the purpose of pointing out that this system of mass returns of desperate people to Libya, first of all, should never be called rescues. These are not rescues of people that might otherwise be abused by smugglers or drown, because yes, they might drown, and yes, they are using smugglers. But the real point here is the overwhelming majority of the migrants do not, under any circumstances, want to be returned to Libya. They are against their will, and the Libyan Coast Guard routinely opens fire on the fleeing boats. So the migrants are against their will being arrested and taken back to a place not of safety and put in prison. These are not humanitarian rescues trying to help migrants. These are paid arrests bestowed by the EU. One big step is to rethink that. And the other, I think, big step is to rethink, to pull the helicopter up even higher, is to rethink how will states in general handle the challenge of desperate people trying to enter their borders. So if you look at two places at this altitude that are engaged in this same practice, the practice being the outsourcing of the policing of migration and the placement of people in third-party territories that are usually failed states, and the funding of that captivity. Just look at the southern border of the US and what the US government is doing in Mexico with regards to Salvadorian and Guatemalan migrants. It's the same protocol. And then the Mediterranean with the Italians sending them out to Libya. And this is where I think you ask a bigger question, which is, well, if we have whatever the statistic is, 20, 30 million migrants predicted to attempt to relocate in the next 3 decades due to the climate crisis. Most of them are going to be relocating to the EU, the US, places where their prospects are better. And right now, the two big meta level policy methods for dealing with this is to outsource the job to states that are even less equipped to abide by the law and treat folks in a legal or humanitarian way. And that's really worrisome and probably needs to be discussed at that level. So I think I'll stop there. I know it's a bit abrupt, but I think that maybe Q&A will allow us to go down some paths, Greg, if you think, or
Yes, I think so. I want to take the opportunity to encourage people to type your questions into the Q&A. I have some hope that we may be able to allow people to ask their questions. I apologize if you can hear a very loud motorcycle passing. I think you have a chance to raise your hand and also put questions in. But at any rate, first we wanted to ask a couple of questions, maybe on with a follow-up of what you said already, Ian. But I think I'm going to turn it over to Christy Brooks first for a question that follows up on some of the things you've said and relates it to the question of the Holocaust and so on.
Yeah, let me just formulate this a bit. Well, I think migrants to Europe or migrants to the southern US, as you've just pointed out, from the southern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean are not a genos, a single nation or ethnicity, but they are often treated as a class or category that needs to be eliminated, a problem that needs to be solved. Without going to the final solution, are there also revealing parallels with genocide in this respect, or are there differences more important than the similarities?
And just buy me some time here on the last part. Are there differences? That last part I lost.
Are the differences more important than the similarities?
And the difference between the migrants, or the difference between historical genocide and this current system?
Historical genocide and the current system. Yeah, I think, thinking about the US border, or in this case, the Mediterranean, we know those folks are coming in from different places.
Right.
So they don't fit the category of genocide, but there's some pretty, there are murderous policies. You've just talked about one of them.
Yeah, look, I mean, my impression is that Ukraine has really shown us, and Jeffrey Gelman had a really good piece like 4 weeks ago on this issue of the disparity between how migrants are being handled in places like Poland. I do think in Libya there are even different cells and different holding facilities for Arabs and non-Arabs. I mean, don't forget, Gaddafi has put, all this really opened up, and Libya became a failed state post-Gaddafi, post our toppling of Gaddafi. And but migration was very much a thing then, but it was under a dictator, and it was very kind of narrowly negotiated in a sort of fiscal fashion, where Gaddafi routinely would go to Europe and say, "This is how much it's going to cost. These are the aid dollars for migration control you're going to need to give me, so that I manage these folks, largely who are sub-Saharan, from coming across the water into your, And there's this famous quote about, when he didn't get the number he wanted, he threatened to turn Europe black. And Gaddafi, who in other moments, skillful politician he was sort of the icon of Pan-Africanism. But when he was also handling migrants, Arab, as he called them, migrants, so light-skinned migrants, as different from sub-Saharan migrants, are night and day, right? How they are handled under Gaddafi. And this has only become more pronounced now. And it's become more pronounced and more brutal now because there's not a small number of sub-Saharan migrants who have been used as mercenaries in the war in the South. So that's fact. There's just historic racism, of you're not, one of us, even though you're in Libya, you're, we're all Africans, but not so much, But also Sudanese in particular get brutalized in the facilities because a lot of Sudanese have been used in the war in the South, and some of those very same brigades in the north are the ones running the militias. And when Sudanese come in, they have a particular grievance with them. But anyway, my answer to your question is I personally see more similarity than difference. If one is a little bit flexible with the definition of the targeted group. In this case, the targeted group is not a certain ethnicity or religion, but it does have parameters. So it's not just Africans writ large or any migrants. We see that. Am I losing you guys? Greg, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think both our reporting and how even so, we took a close look at there's a strange number of Bangladeshis in the facilities. Most of those have come to work the oil fields and got horribly abused in the oil fields in Libya, and they tried to escape their job and they tried to jump in a smuggler boat and make their way to Europe, and then they got captured and put back. And so there's often in every cell a cluster of Bangladeshis, a big group of Sudanese, a big hodgepodge of other Eritreans, Somalis, you name it, and then a smattering of Syrians, constantly flowing. The Syrians are separated entirely. They go to a whole different facility and treated very differently. The Bangladeshis also are separated entirely, which is interesting, to me at least. And then the sub-Saharan Africans are lumped together, and they have the worst fate. To me, that explains certain borders on the demographic that is being targeted. They're all migrants, but certain migrants in particular are very much blocked and are being kind of abused by the system that the EU is funding.
Thanks.
If I can just follow up on that and ask you to imagine for a moment, you're a teacher of, I don't know, let's say smart high school sophomores or perhaps college freshmen who are used to hearing about whether or not they understand it very well, or any of us do, the Holocaust and genocide, but less used to thinking about these migration issues in the same terms. And really, it's just another way of formulating what you're saying. I'm just fascinated by your use of the phrase "a war on migration," kind of full on, because in a sense that makes migrants their own sort of nation, right? Usually you declare war on Ukraine or some, perceived ethnic or national group. And I wonder if that, as we're trying to work through this with students or others, or explain it to others, if that helps to explain some of the methods that are used. In other words, the things you describe, and you might describe in a little bit more detail some of the things you saw there in Libya. Do seem to have a lot of I mean, it's essentially a concentration camp, right? It's in the strict sense of a concentration of the people you want to keep control of in one place. And so that's where it seems like the parallels are revealing. I also at least get nervous when I hear about problems that need to be solved.
Mm-hmm.
The migrant problem, I don't think it's just a cheap verbal similarity of the Jewish problem, or again, Christy alluded to solution, and ominously final solution. Anyway, so I think there might be some revealing parallels here with.
Yeah, I think you're very right. I think the parallels are, in my head, are number one, this is not organic. This is a agenda that has several states that have formal meetings and budgets and discussion about the policy of how to deal with these people. And so once you have multi-state actors that are engaged in an effort to achieve something, that already puts one check in one box. The next thing you have is, and I don't think this is actually, I think this is a little bit different. I don't think that, the Holocaust had a rhetoric of to the benefit of them. There was never that, but there is very clear rhetoric of what we are doing here is to the benefit of our target demographic, and that's where I really think um, we have to push back very aggressively if we're going to ever get to the next hurdle, to say that's utterly false. Uh, and so that's the second thing that I think makes it feel similar to a state-led eradication agenda. Um, the third thing is, just as you said, there is on the ground infrastructure, you know, that is built and highly orchestrated. Again, euphemism here, for the holding of these people, and that's utterly inaccurate because it elides what the holding of them actually entails. So, and where it's happening. Number one, it's happening but by way of EU funding in a place where it is still legal in Libya and it's commonplace to rent out the people for labor. So you, as a Libyan citizen, if there's an undocumented migrant in Libya and they're held at a facility, I, as a Libyan citizen, can show up, fill out the paperwork, and check those people out like library books for a month. They become my responsibility. If they escape, I hear from the militia and the government. If they don't, I don't hear anything. I return them on the due date. What happens while they're under my care can be rape, it can be anything. There is no infrastructure that checks on the status of this sort of use of labor. Well, that sounds sort of familiar, the use of forced labor. And again, this is not isolated hearsay cases. This is widely documented. And so largely the women are used as domestics, but they're used as prostitutes or they're used as sex workers in the home. And the men are used in construction and agriculture largely, but also by specific militias to work on vehicles and to prepare the war effort sent south. Okay, well, there are so many layers of crimes there, from an international perspective. We won't go into it, but that is a third category in which you do really see a parallel to concentration camps and the sort of labor that's being made of these folks. So that's where I think there are parallels.
All right. Well, we do have a couple of questions to start with, a few. And again, I encourage folks, as you've been thinking of things, to write in more. The first one, though, is about the story about the cruise ships, which again first caught our interest for all sorts of ironic and just really devastating reasons when you read the whole story. And the question is, has the Italian government or the Italian public acknowledged the migrant cruise ships or your story about them at all? And if so, do you know what their reaction was? And more broadly, the European public's reaction to the system of the funding of returning migrants to Libya. So what's been the reaction? You hinted at it already, but.
Yeah, I mean, so let me clarify a couple of things on the quarantine ships. The fact of the matter is that the conditions on the quarantine ships were not bad. The concept is worrisome, but the conditions were actually good, by the standards of keeping large numbers of people that have been traumatized in one place. I must say that the Italian government, has funded the International Red Cross, and the standard of care and the facilities on the ships are high, certainly by comparison to Libya. So I think that the story, in my view, wasn't that these folks are being incarcerated on these ships at sea and that is worthy of outcry. I think it's that this is sort of a mind-blowingly crazy, unsustainable method for handling these folks, and um, it might, if identified, it might poke a discussion about the bigger issue, which is like how are we going to not this is triage. How are we actually going to deal with the problem here? And furthermore, I'll also say that the infrastructure on land in Italy, where some of these migrants are then transitioned to after they're released from the quarantine ships, again, is nothing like Libya. So I would never want to start making murky the contrast. I think the real severe and stark crimes are in the Italian government's funding of the return of these people to Libya, and that's really where focus should be. One other sort of fairness element I'll try to add here on behalf of the Italians. The EU is supposed to be a team. They're a group, and they're supposed to shoulder burdens together. Spain, Morocco, Malta, and Italy, and Greece have shouldered the challenge of migration with very little help from the rest of EU. And the help, and Italy in particular, that Italy has clamored for isn't more money. Don't send us your money. Take some of these people. Like there needs to be a bare minimum. Hungary, Poland, you guys need to step up and take a quota of these people, because money isn't really the challenge. It's the ability to retrain them, get them jobs, house them, all these things, and the political consequences of having too many of them in one country. That's how you get right-wing candidates come into office and things get worse fast. And the Italians rightly have turned to the rest of the EU, Germany included, and said, how dare you cast judgment on us when you guys are not taking these people? And I think they're not wrong for that critique. But what I will say they are wrong about, the Italians and those who are backing the return of people to Libya, that is a much easier argument to have. And again, the conditions you asked for a little bit more sense of the conditions. So think of Mabani. So Mabani was a former construction depot, a bunch of warehouses, drywall and lumber and that sort of thing. They, a certain militia decided they were going to turn it into this profit-making migrant detention center. They build it out, usually with migrant labor, barbed wires, a couple new cells. They arm it, and then the way the system works is you can only make money in this business model if you have product, right? And the product and the migrants. The only way you're going to get product is if you've got someone who's in a decision-making position who will redirect the product to you as opposed to your competitor up the block. So the militia that was running Mabani only succeeded as the biggest and most profitable and most brutal because it had a couple of key players in the federal agency called DCIM, which routes where all the migrants will go. So when the Libyan Coast Guard brings the batch of them, 100 of them back to shore, there's a decision that's made. Which facility are they going to get sent to? That's the key business moment. And if your guy isn't on his game, it's going to get sent to your competitor. You need them to be sent to you. What you're seeing here now is the drone that we put over Mabani, and you're seeing these guys crouched after having eaten lunch. And it was this kind of ghostly thing I had heard about in interviews with migrants in Libya. And then we happened to put the drone up. The ghostly thing was, after everyone is brought out into the courtyard to eat, they are not supposed to look around. And if they do, they get severely beaten. These are all males, some kids in those midst. After they eat, they are all corralled into this strange formation where they put their forehead on the guy in front of them's lower back. And if they look to the side, you can see, it's pretty small, but you can see a guard hitting one of them right now for having looked over to the side. They get smacked around. Exactly. All right, I think you can see in this shot. So they all are supposed to keep their eyes like this and stay down. Why? Because, again, this is a typical plantation demographic imbalance. You've got maybe 8 to 12 guys with guns, and you've got 2,000 migrants, right? So the guards are outnumbered by these guys, and they have to keep extreme control over them. And if these guys are allowed to look around, then obviously you're going to be assessing where's the wall we can jump over if we all run at once? Who's the guard that's not paying attention and put his gun down? These are the questions. So these are the moments when the guards are very, very aggressive, and they are standing on top of you until they can get you back in the cell where you can't see anything, and then they're fine. But this is what we put the drone up after we had been told by the Libyan government we would be allowed to visit Abani, As our reporting continued, it became clear that we were focused on things that the government didn't want us to focus on. And so they revoked our permission. And so we instead put a drone up over it and captured that footage.
All right, I'm going to try. Thank you. And there's more. We encourage you to folks to read that article. It's if you're not a New Yorker subscriber, it's freely available on the Outlaw Ocean website. We have a couple more questions. I do want to try. We are experimenting a little bit with our WebEx webinar facilities here, which sometimes can be a little locked down. But I think we have a small enough group that we might be able to get live questions, which would be nice. But we have a couple questions. First is from a question about how much attention there is on this issue in Europe, and are there large movements, popular movements or others attempting to change the policies? Also, is there a real chance that the EU could be held legally responsible for their role in all of this?
So there is some attention paid in Italy, especially Greece and Spain as well, of the brutalities in Libya. And then there's also steady coverage of the handling of migrants that are arriving to Europe. So last year, I think the number was 25 to 30,000. At the height of the crossing crisis in 2015, you're looking at 500,000 crossing. So the Libyan Coast Guard is largely the reason for that precipitous drop, and it's not a happy statistic. Often, again, I just presented before the EU Parliament last week. The backers of this say, "Hey, look, it's working. We're stopping. Look at the drop off in numbers." That's not actually a bragging point. You're sending them to a gulag. That's not a success story. That they're not reaching European shores might be in your interest, but viewed from the perspective of humanitarian law, this is not, or even supposedly the benefit of the migrants that you're rescuing, air quotes here, the drop is not a success story. There are they vulnerable? There's a case that was just submitted to the International Criminal Court about abuses in detention facilities. I don't have high hopes, but who knows? I think that there are vulnerabilities legally whereby if parliamentarians wanted to tie up, lawmakers control the budget, and the budget is what allows Frontex to put the planes over the Mediterranean and to buy more boats. Just last month, they gave new boats to the Libyan Coast Guard. So I think that's a winnable effort if enough parliamentarians wanted to. And there's, a good dozen. We've done 3 hearings now before the commission, and it's always the same lawmakers there, and it's about a dozen of them. They're outnumbered, but I think that they could probably really make a change if they tied up the money that's going to Libyan Coast Guard and the money that's going to Frontex until those agencies can prove that they're not doing what we've said they are.
Okay. I'm going to try something now where we have a question already posted in the Q&A from my colleague Solomon Getahoon. And Solomon, I'm going to unmute you here. I'm not sure that we've ever done this in a WebEx webinar format, but see if you can ask your question and also follow up on your comment. If this doesn't work, we'll just go ahead and read it. So here we go. Solomon, see if that works.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. The person who asked about suing the EU for what it did to African and other immigrants is very important one. Can it be sued? Because it's the Europeans who are making Libya a stateless country as a gatekeeper for refugees that are coming from different parts of Africa. It had also used Spain to do the same thing. And countries like France had a place, I think Caille, somewhere in France, where they hold these refugees and either repatriate them or don't even let them come in near contact with the population, which is one of the questions. The other is there any study or investigation, as you did on the high seas, especially on the Mediterranean Sea, is there any study that's being conducted on the Red Sea to Yemen, which is another stateless society, which is also being, shall I say, a sacrificial lamb between the Arab countries problem, and most of them, these refugees and migrants are facing the same problem that the Africans are facing on the Mediterranean, and especially in the Arab countries. What makes the problem very difficult or even huge on the Mediterranean, from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, is that religion also comes to play. Is there anything that had been done on that regard? Thank you.
The second one is easier because I don't know anything about it. I do recognize the point you're making is true, but that's as much as I know. That Yemen has interesting parallels and is woefully undercovered on these issues. It's one of the toughest places to try to do reporting. But that's as much as I know. I don't know. On the issue of whether and how anyone could be sued, my sense is there are a bunch of different vulnerable targets legally. So, for example, and they're at a smaller realm, but one of the key things that the EU did was it approved through the International Maritime Organization, the IMO at the UN, the establishment of a search and rescue zone whereby the zone of water along the coast of Libya that was officially theirs as a search and rescue zone expanded 90 miles toward Italy. Well, and what that did was it meant that when Doctors Without Borders were attempting to get close enough to pick up the migrants who make it far enough to see what it did essentially is in the cat and mouse race between the Libyan Coast Guard on the one hand and Doctors Without Borders and these other groups on the other hand, it unleveled the playing field and gave the Libyan Coast Guard huge jurisdiction. So the migrants now needed to make it so much further out to sea before they could get scooped up and actually rescued by Doctors Without Borders, who take them back to a legal port of rescue, which is in Europe. Instead, with this SAR, the search and rescue zone that the UN approved, and there were all sorts of technical issues that anyone willing to do it could say, look, this wasn't even approved by your own rules. Revoking that would suddenly give the true rescue organizations much more real estate where they can do their job and not be at risk of getting shot by the Libyans. I had a guy on my team for 5 weeks embedded on a Doctors Without Borders ship while we were reporting on land. And the Libyan Coast Guard was threatening to open fire, threatening to ram them, and saying, you're in our waters. It's not your water. They were not in Libyan waters. They were in Libyan search and rescue waters, which are not even a legal category, but the EU has. So this is just one of multiple examples. There also would be a very viable legal strategy, which would say, look, in the court of law, my dad is a federal judge here in DC, and so I often think that way. In a court of law, if I hire you to drive me to the bank where I'm going to rob it, and you know you're driving me to a bank robbery, you're going to be charged, if we're caught, as an accomplice. Okay, this is the same thing on the Mediterranean. The EU is funding the Libyan Coast Guard to engage as an accomplice, as the transport to the crimes that the UN has already documented in the detention centers. So all some smart lawyer has to do is establish the zone of legality into the realm of the driver of the accomplice car, namely the Libyan Coast Guard, and who funded it, and say, okay, now we are going to actually say, this is the illegality. You've already recognized that. You're the accomplice, the knowing accomplice of the illegality. Therefore, you either need to stop and you need to pay reparations or whatever. So I think there are other that, again, I don't think of these on my own, but law professors that I've talked to say they're there. It's just a question of whether there's political will for these sorts of lawsuits to be filed.
Greg, I just want to interrupt and make note of precisely to the point you just made, Ian, that Dr. Gedahun, who asked the question, points out in the question, at least Ukrainian refugees are being welcomed by European countries and others, but the Jews and Africans were and are not.
Right.
And I think when we talk about political will, where people are coming from matters.
Yeah. And if we're honest, the Arabs are also not in Europe. I mean,
Right.
let's not forget 9/11 and the sort of post 9/11 climate of Muslim, Syrians, and there's not open arms to take Syrians in. And I just don't want to lose sight of that. There's just not that many flowing right now, and they are not by any means right now as blocked as sub-Saharan Africans.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Dr. Gedahun, for that comment. I know we have some others in the audience with maybe even some expertise on the international law angle. I'm just throwing that out there. But let's move to another question in the Q&A. We have a question that asks, do we have an idea of the future of these people? And I think perhaps these people in particular, maybe some of them that you got to know. Are those being detained on the Italian cruise ships slated to be allowed entry into Italy? Are those being held in Libya, being held indefinitely until they can pay to be released?
So the quarantine ships typically only hold folks for 10 to 20 days. And again, that story is 2 years old now, so or a year and a half. So perhaps policy has shifted. But again, in fairness to the Italian government, they have held they're not very good on allowing access to those migrants by lawyers and mental health workers and journalists, but they have been decently good on sticking with certain rules that are imposed on length of stay and these sorts of things on the quarantine ships. With regard to the standard fate of those who end up in Libyan detention, again, whole different world there. Many migrants go 3 or 4 cycles of this, and it just speaks to the desperation, but they find the money to buy a passage on the smuggler boat. They make it 15, 25 hours, whatever, towards Lampedusa, the island in Italy that everyone aims at. They get called in, captured, taken back. They then do 3-6 month stint in detention. They often, the way they get out is either they are able to find someone who can put up the money, wire it to the key militia with a relevant account, and they get sprung. And they get dumped in Gargarash, which is this migrant slum in Tripoli, where all of these folks live, and they sort of cobble together an existence there. Or they get dumped in the desert. There's a fairly well documented situation, especially in Algeria, but also in Libya, where large busloads of these migrants are just getting dumped across the border in the Nigerian portion of the Saharan desert to try to get them out of the country. Or, and this is the darkest of dark, the migrants get sold downstream. So they're held in one facility. They squeeze them, beat them, do what they can, see if they can apply enough pressure to get someone to give the money. And if there just isn't money to be squeezed out of this guy, then there may be, a shop, if you will, down the road, which is in either unofficial site or it's another official site recognized by the federal government, where those guys, for some reason, think that they have some way to monetize them. Maybe they've got some deal with a company that needs work, and the more guys, they've got some other method of making use of these guys. So they buy them at cut rate, take a batch of them and use them for some other way, or squeeze them harder, or maybe they're just more brutal, and they use them. But ultimately, most of these folks get dumped either in Tripoli or across the border.
Are there other questions now that we know that people can use their voices and not just the keyboard? I think you might need to push the hand raise button in order to make that work. I'm sensing we might have also an outpouring of sympathy for Ian Urbina, who is doing this in the midst and the day after his diagnosis with the disease that has changed our lives in the last couple of years. So there's that possibility as well. I have so many more questions that I'm going to.
Don't hesitate. I'm okay. I'm okay.
I guess one of the questions would just be about the water itself. This is the theme of our college, the Critical Engagements Initiative, which we haven't mentioned tonight, but is also a sponsor, especially of what was tomorrow night's planned event with students. And that is the theme of the Outlaw Ocean. If that combines a lot of these just astonishing stories. And please, folks, especially those of you who aren't getting a free book, go get the book if you haven't read it already. So this isn't very well formulated at the moment, but where does the water fit into this? We've had a lot of questions about law and lawlessness. Do you see it as more a convenient excuse in many cases? How is spending most of your time thinking about that last untamed frontier change the way you think about migration, about war crimes, about the issues we've been raising tonight?
I mean, it strikes me that water is, for the sake of this discussion, a place or a thing, right? As a thing, it's something we rely on, and it's becoming monetized and commercialized and becoming too scarce in some places. That version of water is not one we delve into much. So the scarcity of access to and on land use of water, for example. Now, water as a place, the oceans, the seas, as a zone, as a frontier, that's where we live topically. And I did not grow up, with a relationship with the water. I went to the beach every summer, but that's it. I didn't, but I did, I have become quite riveted by it as this expanse that is very different, truly different, for those who go out there in any length of time. The weather, the light, your relationship with time, the interpersonal relationships on board these ships, in even your very biology gets changed. You stay out there long enough. I've experienced this, and I don't get seasick, but I do get land sick. When I come back to shore, my pendulum will not switch back, and I'm throwing up when I'm on land, but not at sea. So it's an amazing thing, and the closest, just as a space, if we put aside the people for a second, as a space, it's addictive, and it's also, I think, as a space, I find it enchanting because it experientially for me was the closest thing to space travel on Earth. I could, I don't have Elon Musk level money, so I can't go on one of those junkets, but right here on planet Earth, you can visit a far off space that is truly divorced from this landed life. So those are the things that attracted me to the realm. And then the people, when we first started the series in the Times, the one thing that my editor said to me, and I immediately saw her wisdom, was that historically a lot of the storytelling and journalism that's come from the space has been focused on it as an environmental story. And we wanted to then, and still, focus on this as a human story and back into the environmental issues. So and they're really great human stories out there. Just the experience of what folks. Again, to be clear though, there's if you think of the realm that is this space where all these people work, the 50 million number I cite. There's the merchant marine, right? 80% of what we consume comes by way of ship. All that stuff is in cargo ships and freight and grain and oil ships, and that's merchant marine. That's a different universe from a work perspective. Union contracts and insurance and whole. Not to say bad stuff doesn't happen there or crimes don't occur there. They definitely do. But the fishing fleet, the distant water fishing fleet, that's the universe that we focus on because that's where things are like from a different century.
Yeah, and I will just follow up with a similar experience of going to the beach, but also in more recent years becoming more acquainted with historical views of water. And my colleagues in religion and other spaces can correct me on this, but water has not been universally viewed as a positive. Sunsets on the beach in human history. Indeed, it seems like if it's a symbol in the Hebrew Bible and indeed the New Testament, it's not a good thing, right? And in the book of Revelation, the seas finally go away because that's where all the bad stuff comes from. And it's reading your book that sort of reminded me of that. And I know it has to do somewhat with what you focus on, but the stories are hard to get through, especially the fishing fleets and the chaos and other things that emerge from that. So sorry, that's a little bit of autobiography there, but I think your book really helped remind me of that.
I would just riff on that for a second and just say my theory on that is that to some degree the outlaw ocean notion is that when you go out into this realm that in literary tradition has been a metaphor for freedom, a metaphor for escape. Yeah, there's the big storms and the creatures and all that sort of stuff that are perilous, but really the evil that exists out there is us. It's us unfettered by rules. A captain of a ship is not the boss, he's God. And if you wrap your head around the very notion that there is this other realm where the accumulation of civilization has sort of not really encroached upon, and a lot of the rules that we thought were sort of fundamental don't necessarily apply, you're going to see some really bad stuff. And that speaks, I think, unfortunately, to our human nature. There's also beauty and heroism and amazing will to survive and ingenuity and civility, but there's also an unusual level of dark behavior because you can. And that's what I think makes it different.
Fortunately, to rescue the rest of you from my kind of Melville poetic ruminations, we have another question from Dr. Gedahun, and Solomon, I may have to ask you to clarify a little bit, but he said, how does freedom of movement, and I think a word might have gotten transmuted here in translation, on the high seas work with the European measure against Africans? I'm not sure if I can quite get the whole sense of that. Solomon, can you, I wonder if I could unmute you to follow up on that question. How does freedom of movement, and it came through as dopeness. I don't think that's what it should be, on the high seas work with the European measure against Africans?
Maybe if I had to guess where that's going, it's where I would take it is there is the UN law of the seas, and there is the sort of the default, unlike on land at the seas, is a protection of freedom, right? Like, so, and that came out of anti-piracy, efforts, and sort of like, look, this, and it was modern capitalism. It was this notion that like, hey, look, this is a shared space. Everyone should be allowed to move stuff through here without getting harassed by other states or pirates. And let's all agree to that protection of the default that is freedom so that we can all benefit from it, right? And that coalesced into the, mare liberum, the notion of free seas. And then we'll team up if anyone starts breaking it, like pirates or whatever. Okay, so that's like at its core. That's an interesting legal. It doesn't belong to anyone, and we're going to collectively protect it as a free space. Okay, so I think where maybe the professor is going is that actually a factor here when it comes to what the Italians say are able to get away with? Heck yeah, he's spot on. Like that is exactly the core of, because the high seas do not belong to anyone, and because the Mediterranean has high seas, the laws are pretty murky. When a Dutch flag Doctors Without Borders ship is at the 25-mile mark off the coast of Libya, who actually has the right to do what? It's kind of murky, and it's usually going to be the guy that's got a gun, and that's because the default of this space is freedom, and uh, and the freedom here is, we say that we have jurisdiction, we're engaged in humanitarian search and rescue, you're interfering, and we're going to shoot you if you come 1 mile further toward that boat before we get there.
Well, thank you, Ian, for that and for all of your answers tonight. I don't see any more here, and I'd like to say we're letting you go early, but it's only 12 minutes to extra time for you to recover. But I'm very grateful for your joining us this evening. And again, I encourage people to keep reading both of the articles, Atlantic and New Yorker, and then the book itself. And we hope to continue the conversation. But thanks everyone for joining us for the Abel lecture this evening, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have
Bye.
a good night, everyone.